So much of meaning has been said already today. So much of relevant significance has been shared already today. That what I had to say feels almost redundant and certainly unnecessary. And I think that's because in this particular congregation there is such a profound sense of community, such a profound sense of caring for one another, that the personal sharing that goes on in the context of our worshiping together so enhances life and so deepens relatedness that we've almost had the worship experience that we need to have and want to have, so that any of us who stand here in this lectern becomes perhaps a helpful addition, but often an unnecessary one. So with that humility, let me try to share as best I can some thoughts about the Christmas event and some thoughts about peace. The scripture for today is not taken from one of the Christmas stories. It's taken from the second letter of Paul to the church of Corinth. But he captures the spirit of the Christmas event quite well when he says to the congregation there, "Dear brothers and sisters, grow in maturity, encourage one another, live in harmony and peace. Then the God of love and peace will be with you." May we have ears to hear what Paul was saying to the church of Corinth, even here, even now. Amen. You know, those of us in the 21st century and those of us who grew up in the 20th century sort of take the Christmas event for granted. It's something that's part of the church's tradition, it's part of our life experience, it's part of our growing up. It's just something that we look forward to and expect and anticipate and live through as if it's a very normal part of the Christian community's orientation to a faith stance. But that's really not historically the fact. Let me put Christmas in historic context just for a moment. First of all, when you turn to the New Testament and you look at the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there are only two Gospels that even mention Christmas. Two Gospels did not even consider Christmas as something important to the content. Now that is a commentary in itself, that only 2 out of 4 Gospels mention Christmas. The second thing that you may not know is that it wasn't until the 4th century, that the church really began to get clear about the Christmas event and what it meant. They really struggled to come to a theological understanding of who this person, Jesus of Nazareth, really was, and how we are to talk about him, and how we are to view him. And so his birth was not a very significant thing compared to his ministry as far as the church was concerned. And Mary was really not that important at all. You know, as one theologian said, the truth of the matter is that Mary was a nobody. And that's what makes the story so poignant. And then it may surprise you to know that under Cromwell in England, the celebration of Christmas was declared illegal. They didn't like this Christmas stuff, both in terms of the theology it represented and in terms of the body way in which Christians celebrated it, because everyone was getting drunk and having a good time. And that didn't seem to Cromwell to be a very appropriate thing, but it was actually illegal. under Cromwell's reign. And the Puritans did not like Christian at all, and the Puritans refused to celebrate Christmas and went for a good quarter of a century without allowing Christmas to be part of their faith stance. These are kind of interesting facts about Christmas. Even the sharing of gifts, it may surprise you, is not something that was part of the Christmas experience. In the early days, the Christians celebrated, and most of European culture celebrated the sharing of gifts at the New Year. It was the end of the year. Everyone had their work done. No one was going to be going out into the fields anymore for a while. And so they celebrated and gave gifts. The gifts of life, gifts from the bounty, whatever had happened for them that year, they shared gifts. And it wasn't until the reign of Queen Victoria in England that gifts began to be shared at Christmas time. And it was Victoria who gave gifts to her kids. And her gifts were, incidentally, swords and armor. And then gave a gift to her husband, Albert. And so the population began to see, oh, well, this is what the Queen does, so this is what we'll do. And so gift giving at the time of Christmas became a tradition. But not until Victoria. Now, from a theological point of view, one has to ask, what was it about this that made Christmas so difficult? Well, the fact of the matter is that Christmas has been difficult for the church because, at least from the progressive point of view, Christmas represents a radical redefinition of the reality of humanity's relationship with God. The reason they struggled with understanding who Jesus was is they didn't know how to deal with the fact that a God could be seen as a human. And so they did not want to celebrate Christmas because they wanted their God out there, all-powerful, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipresent. They wanted their God to be the Almighty God who stood apart from us, under whom we lived and experienced our lives. And this idea that this God who is apart from us, out there in the world of the sacred, apart from those of us who live in the profane, could not possibly participate in the reality of our humanity. And that's what a lot of the church councils were about, fighting over what is the humanity of Jesus, what is the divinity of Jesus, how much humanity is there, how much divinity is there, is he homoousion with God of similar substance, is he homoousion with God of the same substance? Who is this person Jesus? And how does that transform, if at all, this concept that God is out there apart from us in the sacred while we are down here apart from God in the profane? Of course, the council came up with a brilliant suggestion. Well, we'll just say that he was fully God and fully man. No one really knows what that means, but it solves the problem. But the truth of the matter is that the Christmas event taken seriously is the central, most radical redefinition of our humanity to be found in Scripture, to be found in theology, to be found in any philosophical orientation to what life is all about. Because the real existential question that we humans are asking is, who am I? What is the meaning of my life? Why am I here? Is there any purpose to my life? What gives me meaning as opposed to meaninglessness? What gives me fulfillment as opposed to emptiness? What gives me a sense of loving relatedness as opposed to loneliness? And what gives me a sense of creating possibility instead of limits and despair? That's our question. And Jesus refocuses, the Christmas event refocuses that question in a radical way that for the most part the church has not been wanting to affirm. And the time has come for us to recognize the Christmas event for what it is. And that is that the God who was seen as apart from us in the sacred, while we are down here apart from God in the profane, is now the God who is part of us. And so we declare, Emmanuel, God is with us. God is in the flesh, which is the meaning of the word incarnation, in the flesh. But that's a radical reinterpretation of the role of God and the role of humanity with one another. Because most of us grew up in a church where we talked about the sin of Adam. How many people do you know who still go around believing in original sin as if Adam was one man back then? The word Adam, means humanity. That's what the word means. The Genesis story is the story of humanity. Every time you see the word Adam, you translate the Hebrew to humanity. This is the story of humanity. It's not the story of someone who could have been named Fred or George. He's not just named Adam for a reason. Adam means humanity. And so the church has taught us that in the sinfulness of Adam, we are born into this original sinfulness and have to stand always apart from God, dependent, hostile on God, for whatever we can become. And the Christmas story turns that on its head and says, no. God is now part of us. God is in us. As the Quakers say, we can now hold one another in the light and see that of God in each of us. And the God in me celebrates the God in you. Do you see what a radical reinterpretation that is? That suddenly there is no distinction between the sacred and the profane. We could have this worship in the yard. We could have this worship in one another's homes. We don't need a space called the sacred space, because the sacred is what life is. The sacred is where life is. And that's the radical reality of what Christmas, the Christmas event, is really all about. That if you want to see God, you look at a person in the flesh. See, people in the Greco-Roman world were thinking, well, the gods can appear as humans. They can take the form of a human, but Zeus is still Zeus. It doesn't matter who he's seducing or what he's doing. Zeus is still Zeus, and he just appears to be a human. No, the radical difference is, no, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about incarnation. This really is in the flesh. That's why John can say in his writings, how can you say you love God whom you cannot see, when you do not love your brother or your sister who is with you? This is why Jesus could say later in his ministry, you ask what the law is. What's the greatest law? You can't talk about the greatest law as if there's only one. There are always two. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Paul would go on to say, the whole law is fulfilled in this one statement. Love your neighbor as yourself. Because there's no way to love God without loving the neighbor. There's no way to love God without loving the other human being. There's no way to know God except through the love we have And since that is what we experience existentially as human beings, then that is why we say God is love. And those who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. Now you sang the Emmanuel song today. Turn to page 134 in your hymnals. Look at what you said. I don't think we listen to ourselves. Listen to what you said. You sang it together. Sang it twice. Listen to what it says. It's right there for us. Emmanuel, Emmanuel. His name is called Emmanuel. God with us. Get the next line. Revealed in us. His name is called Emmanuel. You hear it? Revealed in us. Not revealed to us. How many of you were thinking revealed to us? Yeah, I told you the answer. Revealed in us. Now, that's the radical interpretation that we need to look at and take seriously, because that calls us to be the persons of peace about which the mythological angels spoke. Peace on earth, goodwill, peace on earth, goodwill to men. Peace on earth. That's why we can pray. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is. Not almost as it is. Not close to how it is. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The distinction between the sacred and the profane is suddenly shattered. The distinction between God and humanity is suddenly shattered. And we suddenly see that we really do live and move and have our being in and with God as God lives in and with us. So that we now have this ministry of reconciliation, God making his appeal through us. That's how radical this is. That's how radical the Easter event is. I mean, the Christmas event is. Now let me say something quickly about Christmas. I know that I should stop right now. Let me just show you something that's really powerful about the story. So here we have the incarnation of God. The creative source of all that has been, all that is, and all that ever shall be is now discovered as well as we can know it in human form, because God can never be known. Anselm was right. God is that in which nothing greater can be known. God cannot be known. But we know God in the human flesh, incarnate, Emmanuel. How does this God appear? The one who comes to free the prisoners, the one who comes to bring light to the darkness, the one who comes to save the poor, the one who comes to preach the good news of life, the one who comes to liberate us from our bondage to ignorance and hatred and prejudice. The one who does all this does not come as the powerful warrior that many people thought the Messiah would be. How does this God first appear? As a helpless infant in a stall, surrounded by shepherds, the poor, the disenfranchised, those set aside. And how ironic is that? That we realize that God is with us. This omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipresent ground of being appears as a helpless infant who is able to stay alive only because humans save him. Who stays alive because some little mother, who probably was about 15 years old at tops, holds him close to her breast and nurses him. Because shepherds come and a father stands guard, and they wrap him for warmth in a stall. What an interesting concept of God incarnate. This isn't Zeus coming as some great warrior. This isn't Jupiter coming with sword and shield. This isn't Mars coming down to earth. This is a little baby. And why is that, you think? Well, this is for another time. But for now, let me just give you previews of coming attractions. All of Jesus' ministry had to do with two dynamics. The relational dynamic and the temporal dynamic. The relational dynamic had to do with coming to understand ourselves, because whatever else Jesus represents, it is a call for us to be all that we are meant to be and to live as fully as we are meant to live as lovingly as we can be. And so all of Jesus' ministry can be looked at from this perspective. The relational dynamic is, he is talking about what is your relationship to yourself, the I-thy relationship, the intrapersonal relationship. What is your relationship to your neighbor? The I-thou relationship. What is the interpersonal relationship? What is your relationship to your creation, the non-human creation? The relationship of responsibility. And what is your relationship to that which is the creative source of all that is? The transcendent relationship. So there's the I, thou, I, it, and I transcendent. Those are the dynamics. The other thing that is characteristic of Jesus' ministry is the temporal dynamic. Past, present, future. Throughout Jesus' ministry, he is always talking about the past is no longer real. It's a reality that no longer is. And whatever you think you've done, that's forgiven and redeemed. It's forgiven. You can't go back and do it over. You can learn from it, but you can't go back and do it over. So all that guilt you got over a past you can't change. Give up the guilt and learn from the experience and move into the present, because the present is the only thing that's real. This is now. It's what we call the eternal now. This is what's real. Stop being anxious about a future, because that's not real yet. You can hope for a future. That's why we have hope. You can hope for a future, but you don't live in that future. You live here and now. That's where reality is. That's where love is. That's where life is. So go back to the infant. What does the infant demonstrate? Life profoundly and only lived in the now. That baby Jesus is not worried about the past. He's not worried about the donkey ride. He's not worried about in utero. He's not feeling guilty about anything. He's not dreaming about some future. He's not anxious about some future. He has no guilt over the past. He has no anxiety over the future. What does he have? He has the now. And what is the now? The love of his mother, the nurture of his mother, the presence of those who love him, the protection of those who love him. That's his now. The community of love is his now. So how brilliant to have the incarnation of God, the one who calls us to the now, the one who frees us from the guilt of the past and the anxiety of the future, and to the love of the present. The infant who only knows now and love. Previews of coming attractions. But there's a reason why there's an infant here. So, life comes to us in many ways. God comes to us in many ways. But now we celebrate. God is with us. God is part of us. God is in us. Emmanuel. Amen.